Sponsored in part by Pediatric Associates of Dallas. Pediatric Associates of Dallas has been providing excellence in pediatric medicine since 1971. PAD has locations in Dallas and Plano and is now open 7 days a week because taking care of kids is what we do.
The following content is not intended as a substitute for professional legal advice, medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your attorney, advocate, physician, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding any medical or educational concerns.
Hi, and welcome to Empower Dyslexia podcast and show. I'm Rachel Chambers.
And I'm Steven Yearout.
And we're here to help you be a better informed partner in education. On the show, we discuss dyslexia and related disorders, research, intervention, special education policy at the state and federal levels, and we also interview experts in the field. So that's what we do here today.
Well, Rachel, we've hit a milestone. We're over 800 likes and followers on Facebook.
On Facebook.
Our goal was 1,000 by the end of May.
Yeah.
So we're right there. So we want to thank everybody for the support that you're doing and giving us. YouTube is slowly growing.
Yeah.
So where's all our YouTube people out there? Make sure that you get out there and subscribe to us on YouTube also.
Definitely. But we thank you for your support. So we can, I guess it's not big news anymore, but you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, which is iTunes, and Spotify, Stitcher, Alexa, AnyPod. What else? TuneIn.
You say
Google
Music, so you can actually just go up to your Google if you got a Google Home, and just go, hey Google, play Empower Dyslexia, and it'll
Same with
pop up.
Alexa.
Yeah.
It's really cool. So.
So that was my phone picking up me saying that. So it wanted to play us. Wanted to play the podcast for us. See.
What is it called? AI.
Yeah. So.
But anyways, that's funny. Okay, so today we're going to do a huge political update today in Texas.
Yeah, and the reason why over the last couple of weeks we've talked more about the laws that are being passed because here in Texas, we're wrapping up our legislative session.
Right.
It ends that session ends at the end of May.
Yeah, Memorial Day.
So we've got a lot of bills that are being submitted.
And discussed.
So I think there was over 1,500 educational bills alone.
Which is crazy.
We want to make sure that the general public understands what's being presented or
and voted on.
So
hats off to our legislators because I read some of those bills. I was reading over some of them that we're going to be talking today about, and some of those are like almost 100 pages, just one bill. And I know they're amending different portions of that bill, but it's just a lot, and like all the legal jargon and stuff. So I have a lot of respect for our legislators and what they're doing, and they really don't get paid hardly anything to do that. They're about $7,000 a year, or maybe it's every 2 years, I'm not sure. But and I know they put a lot of work into it.
We appreciate you and all of y'all down in Austin and all the hard work that you do. Mm-hmm. So today we have Steven from Disability Rights.
Yeah,
Texas.
Steven Aleman. He is an attorney for Disability Rights Texas, and he is down at the Capitol all the time. That's where he's been living like the majority of this month and last month. So welcome to the show, Steven.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being on the show. So why don't you give us a little rundown about what your day is like at the Capitol, being you?
Sure. Well, it varies by the day, but it is sort of sad to say I'm almost living here these days. So every day there's something happening at the Capitol. Usually I try to get here around 7:30 or 8. Kind of get oriented for the day. In the House, a lot of hearings begin at 8 a.m. They're a little bit slower to get started in the Senate, usually around 9 a.m. So you want to make sure that you know what the latest committee meeting is. And even if it was previously announced, there's often very last-minute changes to the agenda. So you've always got to check to make sure that you're aware of all of the bills that might be coming up, because you might suddenly be finding yourself testifying on a piece of legislation that you were not really ready for.
Wow.
Of course, in the middle of the day, the chambers, both the Senate and the House, do meet. They're meeting every day. And so when that happens, all committee work must stop so that the representatives and the senators have a chance to go to the respective chambers. So while the committee meetings stop, there's no public testimony. That doesn't mean your work at the committee ends. While they're on the floor, and presuming you don't have a bill that's being debated, you're still sort of scrambling, checking in about what others are saying about a piece of legislation. You might be revising your testimony because later in the day the hearing will resume once they come off the floor. Right now, sometimes that might be late in the afternoon, and sometimes we've had situations where the House has not adjourned until like 7 in the evening, and then your committee, you literally have waited all day to testify, and your evening is now waiting as well here at the Capitol. So
now, I personally have experienced that, waiting all day in order to testify at like 7 p.m. at night. You know, it's an experience. I think everybody should experience it at least once. You know, I mean, just to be in the room with the legislators on that committee and hear what they have to say, and then hear what everybody else is saying too. And then you get up there and you deliver your 1 or maybe even 3-minute spiel about how you feel about something. And maybe somebody will listen to you.
You better have your elevator pitch down.
Yes.
Perfectly.
Oh, I went out in the hallway and rehearsed out loud, walking up. I'm sure people thought I was nuts, but I mean, I was prepared in the best way I could. So Steven, let's talk about some of these bills.
Sure.
Can you give us some of the highlights on some of the bills that are out there as it pertains to dyslexia?
Sure. Well, there's a lot happening here, and there's a lot of sort of directly related legislation specific to kids with dyslexia and related disorders, and there's others that are a little bit more higher level that might still be of interest. And then, you know, of course, there's the big flagship issues like teacher pay raise, school safety, public school finance reform, that even at those huge bills are literally hundreds of pages long, you might find a neg or two that's connected to kids with dyslexia and related disorders. I can jump right in and talk about probably in terms of the education field, there's 2 bills that we've been watching most carefully that's very, very specifically oriented to kids with dyslexia and related disorders. There's one in the House and one in the Senate. The House bill is House Bill 1199, and usually what we do is once a bill is introduced, of course, it's going to get a sequential number. So House Bill 1199 is just one of about 2,000 plus bills that was filed this year in the House. But it is about trying to follow up on a piece of legislation that was passed last session with regard to early screening and detection of students who might have dyslexia or related disorder. And I'll talk about that original piece of legislation and then why this bill came about. But I want to mention as well that in addition to House Bill, or HB as we just call that for short, 1199, we also have a Senate Bill 2075, SB 2075. It's a very related piece of legislation. It's almost identical, but there are some subtle differences there. So, we are
what
tracking both of those.
so what are in those bills that are dyslexia specific, I guess?
Sure. Well, so just to set the stage for that question, Rachel, 2 years ago, when we last met here in Austin, in terms of the state legislature, a bill was passed to amend an existing Texas law that said that every kindergartner and first grader in Texas public schools had to be screened for dyslexia and related disorders. This was legislation that did become law 2 years ago to make sure that schools are doing everything possible to be aware of a child who might have dyslexia, because as we know, early intervention really matters. The sooner that we can start breeding interventions and we can start to remediate any effects of dyslexia and enable a child to gain the skills to read and learn, and then that sets them up for success in elementary school and frankly through the rest of their life.
And that bill last year or 2 years ago that passed was child fine, correct?
Essentially, it was child fine. What we use this term called child fine, and just for your audience to know, that's sort of a kind of a legal jargon or program term that we use in the field of special education to refer to efforts that the school has to do proactively to try to identify those kids who are struggling learners, particularly those who are struggling learners because of some sort of physical or mental impairment. Generally, we don't want to have to wait until mom or dad comes forward and says, well, Steven is struggling with reading. Why is that? Can you please do some testing? The legislation 2 years ago was about trying to make sure that schools proactively were screening all children, so we throw out a wide net so that we don't miss anybody. So that's the backdrop to this session's legislation. So you asked, well, what it's about. So it is really trying to make sure that districts are actually following through on that mandate of doing that early screening. Unfortunately, what we've heard anecdotally is that some school districts are not quite doing all that screening and referring children who are suspected of having a disability on for further evaluations. So this basically enables the Texas Education Agency, a state agency that is essentially our State Department of Education. What this bill does is grants them the power to police school districts to make sure they're actually doing this screening. It may come as a surprise, and maybe it doesn't come as a surprise to some of your listeners to know that just because you put something on the books in terms of a law means that everyone's following them.
Right.
I won't talk about, how well I obey certain speed limits in certain parts of the state, trying to get from Austin to Dallas or whatever, but it actually happens as well with governmental entities. We tell public school districts across the state to do this and do that, and I'm not saying it necessarily happens because of malice or it's intentional, but there are often times where we find that school districts, frankly, are not doing what the state tells them to do. And so then the question becomes, well, how do you police districts to get them to do the right thing, to follow the law? And this is quite honestly true across the board, but specifically we know, obviously, in this state, and maybe this is a whole other, conversation you've had about the state's problems with following federal law for serving students with disabilities and, past poor policies that we've now hopefully overcome. But this bill is all about trying to empower our State Department of Education, who we call TEA, or the Texas Education Agency, giving them specific directive and authority to go back to school district and say, are you actually screening and following the protocol for all of these students with dyslexia or possible dyslexia in early ages, because we really want to make sure that this law is followed and we get the benefit of the intention behind the law.
So here's a question, Steven. How is the TEA going to, enforce, and what are what's the accountability if the schools aren't actually doing the screenings like they're supposed to?
Well, that's a great question. Now, like all lawmaking, lawmakers will set out like very basic principles about like, well, what's the purpose of this bill and what are we trying to achieve? But oftentimes a lot of the details are left for the agency themselves to decide. And that's the case here. What we have here is a piece of legislation that has, I guess I should mention, has passed the House of Representatives and has advanced to the Senate. It's House Bill 1199 again. So just in passing, I should mention that if your listeners are taking an interest in this, there's still time for you to literally get involved, like you were mentioning, Rachel, your day here at the Capitol.
Yes.
Hopefully there will be a hearing on this bill in the Senate where people could speak up for it. But what it says is that this piece of legislation, as currently existing, it is subject to change. And, everything is subject to change until the governor signs it. It says that the agency has to develop procedures that allows the agency to effectively audit and monitor and conduct periodic site visits at school districts to ensure that they are complying with the early screening and detection of students with dyslexia and related disorders. So how will they?
Sorry, I was just going to say that they used to do this with what they call deck visits.
Yes, back in the, I think they got rid of those back in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And put in this PM,
so overall,
ABS or
the State
whatever it's
Department of Education, TEA, used to do a lot more on-site, in-person visits to school districts. That changed sort of across the board, especially in the area of special education. And but basically, yes, this is the realization that we need to kind of go back and do some of that actual face-to-face contact with school districts. Again, the bill only requires the agency to start developing procedures and processes to audit and check on school districts. But what those specific audit steps and monitoring steps will be will have to be decided.
Gotcha.
And that's kind of part of the whole process here in Austin for folks like me who are try to be advocates on behalf of students with disabilities and my colleagues in other sister organizations. Yes, we spend a lot of time and focus on the legislature, and rightly so, but honestly, our work is year-round because once this bill, assuming it passes, leaves the Capitol and leaves the governor's desk, the next chore is trying to weigh in with the Texas Education Agency to see that they do develop proper procedures and auditing standards. And we want parents and stakeholders all to not lose sight that, this has been, quote, solved. In any issue, you have to continually be engaged and track it.
And maybe, just maybe, the Special Education Continuing Advisory Committee could offer some guidance to the TEA on how to go forward with this. What do you think, Stephen?
I think that there are existing advocacy organizations, there are existing advisory committees, there are concerned parents. Everyone and all of us need to continue to remain engaged, but certainly
Most
that
definitely.
formal group you mentioned, which is a governor-appointed body specifically charged with speaking with the Commissioner of Education, would be a great forum to receive updates and speak for themselves as to this legislation.
Yeah.
So we talked about the screening bill. So what else we have that's up there?
Oh, yeah. So that's just one piece of legislation. Well, actually two. As I mentioned, the two bills, House Bill 1199 and Senate Bill 2075. Just to wrap up on that, I want to be clear that each has passed their respective chamber, but now are waiting for action in the other chamber. So, again, folks can still weigh in on those to advocate that they get a hearing and then show up when they do to testify. But otherwise, we've got other important things happening here at the Capitol connected to students with disabilities, and that would be House Bill 3, which is our overall school finance reform bill, which is an emergency item here at the Capitol. By emergency item, we mean that the governor gets to set out a priority list, if you will, for bills at the Capitol. While the governor, of course, doesn't, introduce legislation himself or play a direct role, the governor can encourage the legislature to speed up its work on certain topics. And school finance reform was declared as an emergency item by the governor at the beginning of this year.
Great.
And House Bill 3 is the bill, and it contains a new funding mechanism for students with dyslexia.
So I was reading over it. It's a big one. It is a big bill. But I skimmed down to the part that's about, dyslexia. But before I got to that part about dyslexia, it crossed out the State Board of Education and put commissioner. So is the commissioner kind of taking over all of the I don't know, the gusto for the finance reform?
Well, sure. So there's, as you said, there's a literally hundreds of pages long
Yes.
of text here in House Bill 3, and there's so many different moving parts, and it's all still subject to negotiation and debate here at the Capitol, down to probably the final day here in about 25 days from now. But one thing that has been noticed is that in our school finance system, and I guess you have to understand our public school system, you have to understand that there's several official bodies that are involved. I mentioned, of course, already the Texas Education Agency, and that is led by a person who we refer to as the Commissioner of Education in Texas. That's currently Mike Morath from Dallas.
Mm-hmm. Who is appointed.
But there's also, but also, of course, there is the State Board of Education, which is an elected body representing geographic districts in Texas. And over time, they have been delegated sort of different as well as dual responsibilities for our public school system. And when it comes to school finance, there are some unique roles that in the past have been delegated to the State Board of Education. Well, the bulk of it, honestly, remains with the Commissioner of Education. Well, what you notice, Rachel, is that in House Bill 3, whatever authority the State Board of Education had in school finance reform, or has up to now, would be removed and transferred to the Commissioner of Education.
So I got a question on that. Why? What's the thinking behind that? I mean, I would much rather have appointed people that is over that piece of it versus somebody that's appointed.
Or you mean elected?
Elected.
Yeah,
right.
Okay. So you'd rather have someone that's elected rather than appointed?
Because those people that are elected, they answer to us.
Right.
If they're appointed, they answer to the governor.
Right. Or, yes.
Although, yes, the governor's elected also, but I want to have people that answer to us directly versus, I mean, yeah, we could go down and ask to have a meeting with Mike Morath, but
we're not going to get a meeting with Mike Morath. Are you kidding? Mike Morath, hi. You want to meet?
love to talk to you.
Love to talk to you someday.
But I mean, I could call, my representative on the State Board of Education, and they'll call me back, or we'll set up a meeting.
Right.
So
Stephen, what do you think about that?
What's the idea behind that?
Sure. Well, it's hard to say exactly, who was behind that piece of it. But I think the general notion, as it's been explained, at least publicly, is that it's more efficient for the commissioner to be in charge of all of the school finance mechanism, because the State Board of Education, as you noted, is an elected body. They have their own public process and procedures, and they have their own meeting cycle where they can only officially take action when they're actually here in Austin, gathered at their State Board of Education hearing room. So not that I'm not justifying the decision, but what we have been told publicly is that this just allows the commissioner to have a little more control, a little more direct influence on the nuances of school finance as opposed to waiting on the, quote, cumbersome process of the State Board of Education.
But I'm assuming that, whatever the commissioner's decisions are as far as state finance goes for education, that it will go through the House and the Senate before it's made into rule, like any of the changes? Or does he just get to change it as needed?
Well, so just to be clear, when there's references to the Commissioner of Education, that essentially is giving him or whoever holds that office in the future the power to make those decisions independently of the legislature and independently of the State Board of Education.
Okay.
As you mentioned, I mean, to some degree, there's, quote, oversight because the governor reviews and watches his activity. Periodically, the Commissioner of Education has to be actually technically confirmed by the Texas Senate. So in some loose way, there's, quote, accountability, but otherwise, the short answer is that when the Commissioner speaks on these pieces, that is it. That's the final voice, final decision. The legislature will not be going back necessarily and having a role to say we agree or we don't.
Well,
don't.
I truly hope that Mr. Morath makes some wonderful decisions.
Well, we have to look at
for the people.
We got to look at we have Mr. Morath right now, but who do we have in the future?
Right.
If they still have that power and we don't agree with what they're doing, there's not a whole lot we can do. So, with that being said, is there still time to voice our opposition against that piece of it?
Well, that is a softball question because tomorrow in the Texas Senate is debating House Bill 3. Obviously, because it's called House Bill 3, this piece of legislation started in the House, worked its way to the House Public Education Committee, worked its way through the Texas House of Representatives, was passed as amended, and was sent to the Texas Senate. And tomorrow, on Friday, May 3rd, the Texas Senate is going to be debating House Bill 3. So if you have concerns about the delegation of rulemaking to the Commissioner of Education or the dyslexia waiver, which we're about to talk about, or anything else in the bill, frankly, this is the day, this is the afternoon to get on the phone or hit the email button and let your state senators know what you feel about this.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm glad we talked about that. So go to House Bill 3, y'all, and look at it and see if you like what the changes. But let's move on.
Just real quick. It's nothing against Mike Morath.
No, not at all.
You have to look at a bigger picture.
Yeah.
If you allow that person that sits in that seat the power to do basically whatever they want with school finance.
I mean, what if they give all of the money over to privatization?
I mean, there's all kinds of things that could happen.
Or no money at all. Or, I'm just thinking worst case scenario. Or maybe they do a perfect job. Maybe they do it better than what the State Board of Education can do or has been doing.
But
I don't
there
know.
has to be there has to be some accountability from us, because this is, number one, our tax dollars.
Right.
These are our kids.
Yeah.
These are our public schools. And I want to be able to pick up the phone and call somebody if I have a problem.
A grievance, yeah.
And work that way. And if they don't do what we say, we can vote them out.
Right. If you show up to vote, people. I mean, show up to vote.
Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. And obviously there's a lot of detail in this bill, being several hundred pages long, but at the end of the day, somebody has to still administer the system, and right now the choice is being made in the version as it is to delegate that detail making to the Commissioner of Education. But one piece that is set would be set in stone in terms of kids with dyslexia in House Bill 3 is a new dyslexia weight. By weight, we mean that when the way the Texas public school finance system works, in general, it's very complicated, but very much in general, the state sets a fixed amount that every school student in Texas is entitled to help support their education. And that amount then sometimes is added to with a supplemental amount on account of that student having some sort of special need or desire to supplement that average basic amount. Now, for instance, we have now in the law a provision that says gifted and talented students are entitled to generating extra funding for their school district. There's been debate about whether or not there should still be a gifted and talented allotment. That's been debated. There's been a lot of testimony on that point, and that's not been finally resolved. With regard to students with dyslexia, the legislation does include a provision that says that school districts will now receive supplemental funding to help meet their needs. It's a little bit of a short provision. There's only 4 subsections to it. By subsections, we mean that kind of takes the overall section and breaks it up into slightly more detailed provision.
So, Steven, I just want to say, I'm just going to interrupt real quick because,
sure.
Guys, this is huge because the state of Texas, there's been people in the state of Texas that have been working on this since the 1980s when the dyslexia law came into being. And they've been wanting a weight, meaning funding for dyslexia intervention since the 80s. And so it's just now, what year are we in? 2019, being written in and voted on. And maybe they've tried to vote on it in the past, but this is, I mean, I don't know. Steven, you might be able to speak to that a little bit more. And I read that the basic student allotment, so they're going to take the basic student allotment, multiply that times 0.1, and that's what funding the students, or the school district or schools, public schools get. Did I read that right?
Yeah, so the way it will work is that, again, the districts will have a student with dyslexia if this becomes law, and then, of course, they get the basic allotment amount, and then they get a supplement to that, which is determined by this multiplying factor. As proposed in the House legislation, it's a factor of 0.1. Mm-hmm. So effectively, that's about $500 or so more that the district would receive on account of that student having been identified with dyslexia,
which is not much.
And there's it's not, it's not a huge amount,
but it's something.
But if you have 100 kids with dyslexia in your district, depending on the size of your district, I mean, at some point, that money will add up certainly across the state. But You're right. But every bit counts, I think.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this:
It is something.
Is that that weight? You said that every student that's identified, in here in Texas, we have the PEMS database that all the schools districts have to report into that says how many, across the board when you're looking at your silos of students. Mm-hmm. But one of the silos is dyslexia. Mm-hmm. So my question is, does the school still get that, say, extra $500, whether that child is identified and has already gone through the program, the remediation that the school does? At that point, do they still receive that $500? Do you know?
Well, this is a great question about how all this legislation works. So as it's currently written, and this also relates back to our earlier discussion about the screening bill and enforcing it, the trigger for the $500 or whatever the sum ends up being is based upon the student having been, quote, identified as having dyslexia or related disorder. So they have to have somehow entered into the system, officially being recognized by the school district as having dyslexia or related disorder, and further, not only that they've been identified, but that student has on record either a individualized education program or IEP that's been written by an admission review and dismissal or ART committee, or alternatively, a Section 504 plan. So there's several sort of little hoops that the student would have to go through, or the district would have to go through with that student before they would be entitled to request that extra $500 or the supplemental amount, whatever the dyslexia weight ends up being.
Gotcha.
Well, so just so our listeners know, even though that you can, let's say 504, you get entered into the system, you have dyslexia, they say, yeah, you're identified as having dyslexia. We're going to start, let's say they start at 3rd grade, you go through 6th grade, because generally the programs are about 3 years. Even after you exit out of the intervention stage, you're still considered, or you're still identified as dyslexic, and your 504 plan continues. So, I mean, that's...
Well, so as the way this is written, for the funding purposes, the student has to maintain having that plan, whether it's a Section 504 plan or an IEP plan, for the district to be able to claim the credit, to claim the extra money. So there is a little bit of nuance here that really kind of gets back to the initial bill we talked about screening and making sure the districts are doing the screening, because until you get the student all the way through the formal process, they're not going to get sort of credit, if you will, and the student isn't going to be generating that extra, as modest as it might be, extra revenue for the district to then turn around and help provide and pay for that education.
So let me ask you this, going back to talented and gifted. So how do you know how much the weight was for TAG, or is? And hopefully it will stay.
I believe it is also a 0.1, which means that it's approximately generating about $500 as well.
Okay.
Roughly.
Okay. Well, hopefully the state will continue to keep TAG and then add dyslexia, because they don't have any funding for dyslexia currently from the state.
Under 504.
Right. And they can't get it through.
So
yeah,
so all of this is up in the air right now. So in terms of, again, going back to the question about, well, what could the listener do today? You could literally call or email your senator with House Bill 3 on the Senate floor tomorrow and talk about the dyslexia way, talk about the gifted and talented way, talk about the commissioner rulemaking authority, any number of pieces in here that you're concerned about.
And so, so everybody contact your legislators if you feel strongly about this. I feel strongly about the weight and other aspects of the bill. So tell us about, because this is the other point that I saw. So 20%, the schools may use 20% to contract of that allotted weight. So I don't know, 20% of 500 is 100. Is that right? Is my math right? I think that's $100 to contract with a private provider. So how does that work?
Sure. So just to be clear, there's different aspects of this new section of law, if it were to become law, about the dyslexia weight. The first piece of it just talks about the actual entitlement that a school district could receive of this supplemental money if they identify a student with dyslexia and have them on an IEP or Section 504 plan. Then the legislation goes on, as it's currently written again, and talks about some discretionary use of the money on behalf of the school district. And this is what you're alluding to, Rachel. What it currently says is that of the aggregate amount that the district receives under the dyslexia allotment, 20%, the district may use that amount to, in turn, enter into, quote, contracts to provide supplemental academic services after school, or I guess in theory before school, for that student.
Right. It can only happen during the school year. Well, with school day, not after school, or it can happen before school, like you said, Stephen. Yes,
I want to be clear that the way this is written, that supplemental services cannot happen during the school day.
Oh, dear.
There is a specific restriction in the legislation as it's written that says that a student could not be excused from school to go and leave the campus to receive the supplemental academic services. The way, again, it's currently written, it's essentially for effectively after school tutoring, other supplemental academic services. And I just want to also point out here that this provision about the permissible use of funds, about the 20% quote set aside, is like literally just 3 sentences long, but it raises about 3 pages worth of questions. Like, well, what does that mean, supplemental academic services?
Well, I was just going to...
What is a private provider?
Right.
So all of those phrases and terms used in this provision, assuming it stays in the bill and it is eventually becoming law, will mean that the Commissioner of Education undoubtedly will have to go through rulemaking to give guidance to school districts and parents about how this will all actually work on the ground.
So would that 20% also be allowed to be used for compensatory services?
It doesn't say that now. So I guess the answer to that is, quote, no.
Yeah, I would think not. It's very...
Because I know they were trying
loose.
to come up with, that funding for the compensatory services. But I mean, that when you're sitting there talking about that, that's what, to me, being, layman's terms, that's what it sounded like to me. But especially if it's only 2 sentences long.
Yeah,
it's not
right.
real.
And I want to be clear that the key term here about what's the money for is, quote, supplemental academic services. But the bill does not define that phrase.
Okay. So, well, let's move on because we're running out of time, unfortunately. We could talk about this for a long time, I think. But tell us about the dyslexia licensure, House Bill 2847.
Okay, so in Texas, people may or may not be aware of this, but there is a small regulatory agency headquartered here in Austin called the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation. We call it TDLR for short. And TDLR runs and regulates several occupational licensing programs. In other words, if you want to be a plumber in Texas, you have to have a license to be a plumber. And you go to TDLR to get your license. And if there's any complaints about your plumber, you would go to them. Well, a couple of years ago, TDLR got the power to regulate what we call dyslexia therapists as well as dyslexia practitioners. And they issue a license, but you don't have to have that license to sort of do this work with people with dyslexia and related disorders. But it sort of gives, I guess, the consumer some degree of assurance that this person meets some minimum standards about competence and ability and criminal background if they have been, quote, licensed by the state and licensed by TDLR. Well, there's a bill. It's House Bill 2847 that has now passed the House, and likewise is pending action in the Senate. We don't know yet when and if it will be heard. But House Bill 2847 is a sweeping bill updating the powers of TDLR to regulate different professions. It involves people from pharmacists to, I think, laser, skin removal or something like that. And then also, though, it refers to dyslexia therapists. And what it says now is that if you want to deliver, quote, dyslexia therapy in a private setting, you have to have a license. You have to have a license from TDLR, and you have to meet the qualifications to get that license as a dyslexia therapist. So that is sort of an important bill. It doesn't, I want to be clear, it does not apply to public schools, but if you use a, sort of private therapy, if you will, for trying to help supplement what a school district is using, then this would be a bill important to you.
So, do you know what the qualifications to get that
license?
That license. Do you know what that is?
Or what it was and what it is now?
The standards for the license are currently set out. You can look at them on the TDLR website, the agency website.
You broke up. I think
Steven, I think we lost you.
Give me just a second. I'm going to get him back on the line, guys.
Okay, so while we're waiting to get Steven back on the line, we've heard a lot about this bill, like a lot this week.
So on the surface, right? I think that having some type of regulatory certification, whatever, that says yes, this person has met some standards.
This is Steven.
Oh, hey, there you are.
Sorry, this is I'm at the Capitol, and sometimes there's too many people on their cell phones around here.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm glad we got you back.
Sure, but just about HB 2847, I'm not sure where I got cut off, but basically there are current standards set out in the occupations code. This is not in the education code. This is in the occupations code. Mm-hmm. But there's specifications in the occupations code about the requirements to become a dyslexia therapist in Texas. And so the bill would essentially mandate that you meet those standards if you want to, quote, provide dyslexia therapy going forward.
And who, on this new bill that was passed by the House, who are they saying that dyslexia therapists, licensed dyslexia therapists are and can be?
Well, I mean, I guess it's anybody who can meet the standards that are set out in the law.
And what are they saying the standards are?
Well, those standards are basically, as I said, about educational standards. You have to have a master's degree. Mm-hmm. Then you have to meet a certain number of hours of sort of like clinical practice, if you will, practicum training, and demonstrate that you kind of had some hands-on experience in working with people with dyslexia. That's the nature of the requirements are set out. There are very specific number of hours of training you have to have received about dyslexia. In a certain nature. So all of that is spout out actually in current law. So there's no, I want to be clear, there's no change to the standards to become a dyslexia therapist. Those are already known in law, are not changed by the legislation. But what changes is that instead of being sort of a voluntary license to sort of stand out from the crowd, if you will, if you wanted to do any work in the field of dyslexia in the private sector as private practice, then you would have to come to TDLR to get that license.
So from my perspective, I don't have a problem with making sure that the person that is going to be delivering the services has a standard, a high standard of education and
right.
or hours of working with kids. I don't have a problem with making sure they pass a criminal background check. I don't have a problem
with continuing education.
Education. However, my biggest problem is we know currently, and we're trying to change this, but we know currently where the biggest offender of not providing these services properly is the school systems.
Right.
And this completely leaves the school systems out of it. Mm-hmm. So if, as a parent, if I am not happy with what the school system's doing, now I've got to go to the private sector.
And I mean, as of right now, I was told that there's only 850 licensed dyslexia therapists in the state. And we have approximately 1 million dyslexics in the state. So I don't know if you're going to make it more stringent right now. I feel like we're going to be skimping on the services that we already struggle so hard to get. So
I think
it's a good goal, though, to have people masters prepared and everything. But right now, we need an influx of therapists to give therapy to all of our kids that need it. So I don't know.
Is there any more that you can? I mean, because there's all kinds of programs out there. You've got Wilson, you've got Linda Mubel, you've got Orton Gillingham, Herman, Barton, and not all of these, Nyhouse, not all of these use that credential,
that's stringent.
That certified academic language therapist or licensed dyslexic therapist.
But they have their certificate in their trained program.
And that's what the handbook had set forth, the last handbook that we had. So I'm sorry, go ahead. What were you going to say, Stephen?
Sure. Well, so well, there's a lot, I guess, to be said, but I know we're also running out of time here, I think. But well, first of all, I want to make the point that this bill has passed the House, but has not yet been given a hearing in the Senate. And because this is an occupational licensing bill, I want to be clear, this is not considered an education bill.
Right.
This has been referred to, I think, like the Senate Commerce Committee or something like that. So it's not, you're not going to, if you're used to following education legislation and all the rest of the stuff we've talked about is like education bills and before the education committees in the House and the Senate, this is a different sort of nature of a bill that is more about like economic regulation of professionals. And because of that, it's not being considered as an education bill. And so you kind of have to just keep that in the back of your mind and know that it's kind of on a little bit of a different path because it's also, as I mentioned, a sweeping occupation regulation bill. The piece on dyslexia and dyslexia therapists is just like literally 4 pages out of a 100-page bill.
Right. Awesome. Well, Stephen, that is, I think, all the time we have today. And I know you're super busy at the Capitol. So we're going to tell you adios. And thank you for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. And again, you know, the session is like literally about 25 days from being over, but there's still time to have your voice heard. But it's basically right now.
Okay.
So good luck to you all.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay, so Steven, not Aleman, but Steven Yearout. What do you think about this last one?
It's hard for me to get behind personally, right? I understand the methodology or the idea behind it. I mean, we spoke to a lot of people about this on both sides.
It's been a busy week.
On both sides of the issue, right? I don't have a problem with a lot of what they're asking, but when you limit from what I understood, when you're limiting the possibility for me as a private person to take my child or myself and go get services from, you know, whoever it is that I as an educated person, or hopefully I'm going to understand what I'm getting myself into. Now I know that there's a lot of people that get taken advantage of.
Right.
And that's why we have to be very educated when we go ask these questions and what you're doing. I mean,
because Daphne told us that, you know, you can go to a weekend training, and then these people that go, that are mainly based for parents, or just teachers that want to get a little bit more information for their students that they see in the classroom, but not to actually teach dyslexia intervention. But those people are going out and hanging shingles saying, okay, I'm a dyslexia therapist. So there's that part of it. But
I think
there's also part of it like, okay, my kids went through a CALT, and I love CALTs, you know, a certified academic language therapist. They have been essential to my kids' development in reading. They still can't spell very well, but there's other kids that, you know, take flight, the main method that CALTs use.
Good point. I put a
doesn't work for them.
I put a question out on Facebook, and I said, hey, specifically, what programs did not work for you? And it ran the gamut. Every possible program that you can think of that's out there in the marketplace was named.
Yeah. Including Take Flight.
Yeah, including Take Flight, Orton Killingham,
so
you name
each
it.
kid is different, you know, and each kid, you know, is going to respond differently to a different type of therapy. So if we limit it to just one, it makes me a little nervous.
Personally, I would like to know, well, how many of these people that are out in the marketplace here in Texas?
Right. Well, how big is this problem?
Yeah. How many of those people have actually just gone out and hung a shingle after taking a weekend course and, you know, aren't background checked, security background check or anything like that? I mean, how many of those people are out there? And then how many kids are actually being serviced in the private sector, because we know for a fact how many kids are being serviced in the school system.
Yeah.
And that problem is way, to me, I'll say that, for me personally, is way bigger than this other piece of it. Not that it doesn't need to be addressed, because I think, at some point it definitely needs to be addressed. And I want to help get behind it. But the way the wording is right now, for me personally, I can't do that.
Yeah. I think it needs some work. I think they're getting, it's
going in the right
valuable,
direction.
But it just needs some work.
Right.
And I would like for it to go that way. That's how nurses went. We started out hundreds of years, 150, 200 years ago, where we lived in the hospitals and got our training in the hospitals. And then it turned into an associate's degree type thing, like a 2-year certification. And then it went on to a bachelor's. Now you can get your associates and bachelor's, and before that, diploma. So diploma, then associates, then bachelor's, now master's, now PhD, and we've done all this research. And that's the other thing. What is the research? Where is the research? Have they done peer-reviewed, double...
triple randomized, blind studies.
On the therapy that they're saying that theirs is the best.
The gold standard.
That's
what we want. We want to make sure that our children are getting the best.
Well,
not only in the private sector, but in the school system. Because the private sector is only for those people that can afford it.
Right. And it's not cheap, guys. It's not cheap.
So we're not trying to alienate anybody by any means. We appreciate all the hard work that our certified academic language therapists
are doing and
our
continue to do.
Language dyslexic therapists do, and we support them 100%. But it's really up to you, our audience to make your own decision, really.
Yeah.
So
I wanted to give one quick shout out, and then we really have to go. But I saw this article, and it was really well done reporting. I said that bad, but it was based on the science of reading, and the people in Arkansas are doing stuff based on the science of reading. Okay, and so these dyslexic parents have come out in Arkansas saying 40% of our kids can't read, and 40% of those are not dyslexic, so we're failing here. You guys need to do this program. And they've been working for about 7 years to get this to pass through legislation, and they've done it.
Well, there's a video.
Seeing the differences.
It's a PBS video.
Yep.
We'll actually
great reporting.
We'll go ahead and reshare that out there for everybody.
Yeah.
So again, as we wrap up our show, thank you so much for all of your support. And we always leave you with, if you feel that your child is struggling and there's a possibility of having a learning disability, please don't wait. Go out and start the referral process to get them tested. We have links on our website, www.empowerdyslexia.info, where you can just take the template, put your information in, send it to your school counselor, and get that process started.
Yep.
You'll be very happy that you did, and your child will too, to understand exactly what's going on with them.
Yes. Okay, well, thanks for joining us today, guys. I hope you thought this was a informative show. Get out there and call your legislators if you feel strongly about anything.
Get involved.
You can get involved, and join us next week.
See you there.